Yeah. Okay. So today I want to discuss an interesting topic, and that is what happens when sefarim are burned. What do we do in response if sefarim are burnt, and also is it ever permitted to ideally burn sefarim? Okay. So just for some background, everyone knows the famous.
Why would you want to burn sefarim?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's try to get through this. So everyone knows has some background. We know that what was known as the Paris Talmud, the burning of the Talmud, burning of the Gemara. So what was the story? So there was, in the year 1240, there was a Jew named Nicholas Donin who converted to Christianity. We always know that the Christians always like the ones who convert to their side. So anything they said quickly found favor in their eyes. And this person set out to claim that he made two claims. One was that actually the Talmud proves the veracity of Christianity. And in addition to that, he also said it was at the same time it was insulting to Christianity. So he wanted to get the Pope, the church to come out and officially ban the Talmud. So they decided they're going to have a debate. Let's make a debate, and then the debate will settle the matter. Now, as we know, usually these debates weren't very, they weren't on equal footing, and no matter what they did, essentially, they couldn't win. What was the expression? Tells I win.
As I win, tells you lose.
Yeah. Something like that. So, okay. So who was going to be on the Jewish side? It was going to be the famous Baal Tosfos. The Baal Tosfos lived in France at the time, and Rabbi Teitelbaum of Paris, who was brought many times in the Gemara, and he's going to be the one to debate this Meshumid. So he debates the Banin, and what happened was this eventually became. They decided that it was settled in favor of. In the Christians. Now, he agreed that it didn't prove necessarily the Christian faith. However, he did say that it was insulting to Christianity, and therefore he said, and the question of what year it was, 1240, 1242, 1244, but he said that 20 wagons, he said that the Talmud has to be burnt, and it was either 20 or 24 wagons. And we also have to appreciate, nowadays, it's quite easy, relatively easy to print sefarim, right? If you go look at take a tour of article, you see that Baruch Hashem, they're coming out like hotcakes. Yeah, but thank you. But back then they didn't have the printing press, right? The printing press only came much later, so it was a big deal to have Gemaras, and they went ahead and they confiscated every single last Gemara and they burnt it in the town square, and in
Paris, right?
In Paris, exactly. Some 12,000 volumes. And this basically was the end of it all for the Jewish community there. From there, it went downhill. So, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch Siman Taf Kuf Pei, so the Shulchan Aruch there is discussing the various, and actually, by the way, this debate is recorded. There's a sefer called Otzer Vikuchim. It was put together by J.D. Eisenstein, and he basically records. He has a bunch of debates. So there's a famous one. Everyone knows the most famous one is probably the Ramban with Pablo Christianity, but this is also recorded in there, and you kind of get the idea for what the debate was back and forth, which each side claiming what they were claiming. So if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, okay, here, Shulchan Aruch, this is Siman Taf Kuf Pei 580. The laws of Tainus. There are some who say that a person they were gozer, they enacted that a person should fast every Monday, Thursday, al Churban Abayis, for the Churban Abayis, Val Torah Shenisrafa, and for the Torah which was burnt, V'achil Hashem, for the desecration of Hashem's name, but in the future, these will become days of joy. So, if you look in the Magen Avram quotes Kasav Tanya, the Tanya writes. Now, this is not the Tanya of the Lubavitch. There's a different Tanya. There's an earlier sefer, which is the Talmud of the Maharam Rutenberg. He writes, B'yom Shishi Parashas Chukas. On Friday of Parashas Chukas, Nogu Yuchidim Lasanos. There are those who have the custom to fast. Sheba'osa Yom Nisr Chav Kronos Maleim Sefarim B'Tzarfas. Because on that day, on that Friday of Parashas Chukas, 20 wagons worth of sefarim were burnt in France. So what's the obvious question here? On the Friday of Parashas Chukas, most fast days, what do they have? They're a date. Their specific date, right? Asar B'Tevis, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. Friday of Parashas Chukas could be on a number of dates, right? Yeah. So why is this fast of all days attributed to the Friday of that parsha, right? We should say whatever. Donald, go look on a calendar, find out what date it was. It was Chukas, whatever, figure out the date, and from there on, it should become the fast. So the Magen Avraham continues, he's quoting the Tanya. They did not attribute it to any specific date. Because they did a she'elas chalom. I remember what a she'elas chalom is. It's basically where you ask heaven, you go to sleep and you ask heaven, and then you get back a response. There's a whole very interesting sefer from called Shilas Chubas Min Hashemayim. Response, question and answers from heaven, right? Where they would ask their halacha questions, right? If you can't figure out what's the answer, I'm dealing with a difficult halacha question, so they would. There's a whole process how it was done, and you go to sleep and you wake up and there you have your answer. So the obvious question on that is very nice, you got an answer from heaven, but what's the number one rule? Torah bashamayim, right? Torah's not in the heavens. We all know the famous Gemara when in Bava Metzia when he tried. It was Rabbi Lezer and was having an argument with Chachamim, and he said if the halacha is like me, then the wall should almost fall down, and then the water should stop and everything, and all these simanim came, and they came true, and what they would say, Torah bashamayim, very nice, you could do all these miracles all you want, but that's not how Torah works, right? Once Torah is given, the Torah is given to us, for us to determine the halacha. So that's always becomes debate. Can we rely on this sefer, Shilas Chubas Mishamayim, because seemingly it would seem to run counter to this rule of Torah Bashamayim. So if you look at the edition, there's a great Talmud Chacham named Rav Reuven Margulis. He was an absolute genius. He wrote too many sefarim to count, and his most famous one is probably Margulis Sayama Sanhedrin, a beautiful sefer on Maseches Sanhedrin. But among his sefarim, he would publish, he published old sefarim with kind of nice introductions and footnotes on the bottom. So he writes in the beginning to this sefer Shilas Chubas Mishamayim. He kind of he gives a nice introduction and all the rules when we could and when we don't rely. But it's very interesting. So in any case, they did a she'elas chalom. They asked in a dream, and they were told that this the reason why this happened it's nothing to do with the date per se, but it's specifically the Friday Parashas Chukas. Because how do we start with Chukas? Zos Chukas Torah. This is the Chuk of the Torah, which is translated in Onkelos as Dog Zeres Araisa, which is this is the Gzeir of the Torah. So it's referring to this Gzeira which happened, this decree which happened that the Torah is to be burnt, and that's why it became the fast day became associated with the Friday of Parashas Chukas. Okay, then he says also Vegam b'shnas Tach. We know there's the famous pogroms of Tach v'Tat. Nechru v'shnei kilos gedolos b'sayom. Two great community were destroyed in that day. And this became this. We say this on Tisha B'av, the famous Kina, which was authored by Rabbi Rutenberg. Rabbi Rutenberg was actually he was present at the time, most likely. He was a Talmud of the Rima Paris, and he was an early Rishon. And he wrote this beautiful Kina Shalitz Rav Eish, in which we mourn the burning of all these sefarim. Okay, so that's what. I don't think it's so common for people to fast anymore on this fast day, but in any case, it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch.
The Friday before Chukas.
The Friday of Parashas Chukas, yeah. The Friday of
Some
Chukas.
people do.
I haven't heard of it. In general, the general rule of fasting when it's a non-obligatory fast is that I think it's brought down that if you tell people, then you lose the schar. You're not supposed to keep. I know a very chashuv person. Yeah. He won't even utter the words that I'm fasting because you kind of lose the point. So what are they? Those who fast don't talk. Those who talk don't fast, right? Something like that. Okay, so.
I came in a little late, but didn't they attribute the burning to what they had done to the Rambam?
Oh, very good. Yeah, there are those who say, we know that when the Rambam originally came out with his sefarim, I'm more specifically the Moed Nevuchim. The Moed Nevuchim discusses matters of philosophy, and there are people who are against it. And originally, I think they also say that Rabbeinu Yonah was originally the Rabbeinu Yonah, the author of the Sha'ar Tshuva, one of the classic Musar sefarim. So he originally came out against the Rambam, and then later when he realized that it was a mistake to do that. So he put himself in a self-imposed gullus and self-imposed exile to kind of atone for what he had done. So there are those who say that it was a punishment for having burnt the Rambam Svarim, that this was burnt. I've also heard, right, wasn't the Notre Dame Cathedral, is that right there? I believe it's
right there. Yeah.
It's right there. So when it was recently burnt, right? Didn't the?
Oh yeah, it was burnt.
It burned. So there are those who, again, this is above my pay grade.
What goes around comes around.
Exactly. There are those who say that, but Yeah, I'm just putting that out there. Okay.
So we bought the yeshiva just bought the Rambam. We got a whole set.
Oh yeah.
Rambam.
Ah, excellent. So we're making up for it. We're making up for it. Yeah, it has certainly come back. Yeah, the Rambam has certainly come back. Although I will say that even still, the Moed Katan is much less learned, and everybody should ask a rabbi whether they should learn it. Yeah, topic for a different time. Okay, so the Gemara Moed Katan. The Gemara Moed Katan is discussing how do we know that if a person witnesses a sefer Torah that is torn, that they have to tear keriah, right? Let's say if a person sees a sefer Torah that's being torn, so they have to rip their own begadim. So this is talking about when Yehoiachin was the king, as the Jews are about to go into exile. Vayikra Yehudi shalosh dals of arba. So they read 3 or 4 columns or stanzas. Vayikar batara sofer v'hashach al eish shel ach. So it says they read 3 or 4 stanzas, and then he ripped it out with a razor and he threw it into the fire. My shalosh dalsas v'arba. What does it mean that they read 3 or 4 stanzas? Amr lo Yehoiakim. So Yehoiakim was the king at the time. So they told the king Yehoiakim, Kasav Yirmiyah Sefer Kinos. That Yirmiyah composed a Sefer Kinos, which is Eicha, right? Which later became Eicha. So Eicha was actually written before the Churban Beis Hamikdash, before the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, and is Yirmiyah prophesizing what's going to happen and the great mourning, the great tragedy of when the Beis Hamikdash will be destroyed. Amr lo Maksibbe. So he tells them what's written in this prophecy. So he said, Eicha Yash Badad, how she sits destitute and alone. Amr lo Ana Malka. I don't care. I'm still king. She could. Yerushalayim could burn, but I'll still be king. So that's all right with me. Amalei Bachas if Kabalayla, she'll cry at night. Anamalka, that's fine. I'm still king. Gol Siyudim Oni, they will exile themselves from their poverty. Anamalka, I'm still king. Darketun Avelus, Anamalka, same thing. Hoyut Sarah Rosh, but its adversaries, so its enemies will become in charge. Will come on top. So Amr Lahu Man Amra. So who said this? Hashem Hogal Rapashah. So they told him that it's coming from Hashem. There's a nevuah, there's a prophecy from Hashem. Miyad Kadr Kal Karshaba. He ripped out all the mentions of Hashem's name. V'sar from Eish. He threw in the fire. Behind it, except like Pachadu v'Lokaras Begedim. And then the pasuk there says that the people who were standing there, they're not afraid. Meaning they just witnessed this terrible sight that he had ripped out Hashem's name and he threw into the fire and burnt it, and they did not tear. Mechlal debol nikra. So what do we see from here? That you have to tear. Meaning if the pasuk is criticizing them for not having torn their begadim after having witnessed Hashem's name being burnt, what do we see? You see very clearly that a person, after having witnessed the name of Hashem being burnt or being torn, ripped apart, because it was first ripped apart, right? He took a razor and he ripped out that part. So you see that a person has to, one is required to tear the begadim upon witnessing such a thing. Okay, so you see the Gemara very clearly says that it's to witness such a thing is terrible. It's actually everyone's always heard of a fast day. As we mentioned before in the Shulchan Aruch, the Gemara, but from the Gemara itself would seem to indicate that the obligation is only ripping. Where exactly this turned into fasting is a bit unclear, right? Like we also if Chas v'Shalom Sefer Torah falls, right? So this whole discussion: is there an obligation to fast? Is only the person there, the whole shul, maybe the rabbi? But I'm just saying that mentioning that the fasting part is actually a little less clear.
When I say the whole shul, you mean those who were there at the time?
Yes, those who witnessed. I think it would only be limited to those who witnessed it itself. I wonder.
I don't know. Sometimes if it's covered in a whole bunch of other things. Mm-hmm. Actually, that's why sometimes if I see someone struggling, I'll run out. I've done that many times.
Oh wow!
And Yeshua did that once or twice.
Wow! Thank you, Chaim.
I see it right near the door.
We could always count on Chaim.
No, after flee, I wouldn't have to fast. Although I think I heard a case in the yeshiva in Israel where that happened, and yeshiva administration ruled so as not to disrupt their learning. I think it was predetermined day. Instead of fasting totally, they should just eat bread and water.
Really? Yes, it is interesting. So bread and water, that I haven't heard. But when we were discussing Monday and Thursdays, we mentioned before some of the minhag the custom to fast every Monday and Thursday. And there are those who don't necessarily fast Monday and Thursday, but they refrain from basar yain, from meat and wine on Monday and Thursday. In fact, and if you go to Yeshivas Mir, so in Israel the main meal of the day is lunch, right? I think in most European countries like that, right? They say it's healthier. So in Mir, they do not serve meat or chicken on Monday and Thursday. So like Sunday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they'll have chicken or meat for lunch, and Monday and Thursday is always the milchiks. I think that's when you always see people frequenting the local pizza shops and falafels if they're not really interested in lunch. Okay, so with that being said, so we see how tragic it is to witness a Sefer Torah being torn or ripped or burnt. So the question then becomes, is there ever a situation when it would be permitted to actually burn a Sefer or a Sefer Torah? And you're going to ask me, why in the world would you do that? So if you take a look, and this became a very controversial topic, this is between the Shvus Yaakov. The Shvus Yaakov was authored by Rabbi Yaakov Reisher from Reisha, which is actually where my grandfather is from, in Poland. And he was a great, great Gaon. He wrote his true sefarim called Shvus Yaakov, which means like the response of Yaakov. But he also wrote many other sefarim. Chok Yaakov on Hilchos Pesach. I think it's only Hilchos Pesach, maybe a little bit more. But that kind of became like the standard, final authority on all of Hilchos Pesach. Mishnah Berurah in Hilchos Pesach, quotes him all the time. He also wrote Torah Shlamim on Yordea. Very, very important halachic works. So this became a big debate between him and, it's always a good person to pick a fight with, your Mechutin. He had a Mechutin named, he wrote a sefer called Knezi Cheskel. His name was Rabbi Cheskel Katan El-Bogan. Katan El-Bogan is like a famous rabbinic name. I'm sure you know Rechov Katan El-Bogan in, I think it's Harnof?
Street in Harnof.
Harnof, exactly, yeah. Rechov Katan El-Bogan. So this came from a famous rabbinic family. So this became a big debate between the two. And it goes as follows. So the Shvus Yaakov starts as follows. Nishalti b'shnas Tapei Gimel b'chodesh Nisan. I was asked in the year Tapei Gimel, Al dvar kisvei kodesh akurim v'abluim sh'misram b'chol shana v'shana k'shemnakim batan chal Pesach. Right. So you have these kisvei kodesh, these sacred writings, which are worn out and torn, and they just build up. All right. When it comes time to clean for Pesach, ve'ein aliyas Pesach nes m'smak achilam. Right. The attic of the shul. There's only so much you could stuff in the attic of the shul. He says, and to add to that, it's not so simple to just put tons of dry paper, because that's basically just, if God forbid there's a fire, that can be very dangerous. So what they started to do, they started putting all these Kisei Kodesh into these big, containers. And they would bury it. And what happened? But the non-Jews would come and steal it. And this, it would come to a great bizayon. It came so bad that they actually started to, back then before the advent of toilet paper, so they had to use whatever they found. So they found, the non-Jews found these old pieces of paper. They said, oh, perfect, we have our toilet paper. Terrible, absolutely terrible. So the question was, maybe it's better that we should get rid of it before something worse happens to it. Okay, so if there's ever going to be a case where it might be permissible to burn sefarim or burn old worn out Kisvei Kodesh, perhaps this would be it. So he begins as follows. Right? So he was previously had been a rabbi in Prague, which was a great city, and he didn't want to issue a ruling leniently. Because he already saw in the Chuvas Beersheva whether it's ever permitted to burn Kisvei Kodesh. He also wanted to know, perhaps there's a difference between a Sefer Torah, right? And, the Gemara which we were discussing was discussing a Sefer Torah. But nowadays, we're dealing with things which are printed, right? So maybe it's not the same. Or Sefer Torah, which is, handwritten by a sofer, so he's hopefully with, a righteous sofer who goes to the mikveh before he writes the name of Hashem. So perhaps that's not the same as something which is made by a machine, essentially, right? The Gutenberg printing press, which is, what year was that? Sometime in the 1500s, I believe.
I think you're right.
Yeah, something like that. So the question is, maybe that'll be a little different. So he quotes the Beersheva. He says that there's nothing to rely on, and the people who started doing this, Chadash Mikarbo Lo Shiram Avaseno. This is a new invention. None of our forefathers had ever done such a thing. So that which they say that it's more respectful to actually burn them, because there's a worse option. Taina Rekanasi, there's an empty claim. Lo Shriv Lakaima, there's nothing to it. There's no validity to it, because there's a halacha which says you have to bury it. the Gemara Megillah says, Sefer Torah Shabbalah Gonzo Seitz L'Talmid Chacham Afilu Shon Lachas. So if a Sefer Torah is worn out, it's buried near a Talmid Chacham. And you put it in a, not only do you bury it, but you don't put it directly in the ground. You put it in an earthenware vessel so that it can last as long as possible. And the Ran says,
in a casket.
that's what it seems like. Yeah, exactly. That's a good point because when it comes to a person, we wanted to specifically to. Okay, so the Ran says that even though we do Geniza, we want it to last as long as it can. So what do you see from here? You see from here that a person is not supposed to, that you're not allowed to burn it. Okay, so the Shus Yaakov continues. He says, however, I saw over here that there's no, very nice you're saying that you got to bury it, like the Gemara says, but I see here that's just not possible. Because each and every year, there's a buildup of so many sefarim until the point that there's no, there's not enough room. He says, we don't, they don't give it, the non-Jews don't give us so much land. It's not like we have endless amount of cemetery plots, so we can just keep on adding more, and we don't have so much. And he says the people who did it, they certainly were relying on some type of heter. So the question is, there's got to be some leniency, some justification. So the Shus Yaakov now goes on and he brings a fascinating proof to this idea that would be permitted. And this is not the type of proof that that a person's mind would immediately jump to, but that's what it takes the genius of the Shus Yaakov to come up with this. And he says we have a story in Shmuel when Shaul was aware that he was about to be killed, right? So it says Vayomer Shaul lenosei kelev Shaul charbecha v'tekreni ba. So he tells him, take your sword and stab me with it. Penivo arelim ha'elav v'tekrani v'salubi. Lest these arelim, these non-Jews, come and they're going to cause a bizayon to me, right? So Shaul knew that he was about to get killed. He knew it was the end, and he was afraid that not only would he be killed, but that the people who, they would put him in a they would be mavazeh. They would disgrace his body. So he told him. What did he tell his servant? Told his servant to kill him. Better that he should be killed, right, than to allow his body to be disgraced. Even though somebody who commits suicide is from the most severe sins, there's no portion of the world to come. Now it's interesting, on the bottom over here, so whoever, this is Mechon Zichron Aaron, so he says that, he says that somebody who commits suicide has no portion of the world to come, so it seems like he's quoting Chazal by saying this. He's quoting some source. He says that they're unable to find such a source. Maybe somebody has a source. If they do, they can let me know. But he's saying, we know that it's a very severe sin, but he's pointing out that we don't, have a clear source. Just as a side point, I will say that although ma'av l'atzadas is certainly a terrible sin, and strictly speaking, a person does not even mourn to have any veilus over somebody ma'av l'atzadas. Ma'abed atzmo ladas, which means somebody who destroys himself.
One more time, but slowly.
Ma'abed atzmo ladas. Ma'abed means to destroy. Atzmo means himself. Ladas means willingly. Okay. So somebody who's ma'abed atzmo ladas, strictly speaking, there's no avelus, there's no mourning. However, it is very rare that it's actually treated like that, because almost always do we say that it was due to some terrible situation.
Temporary insanity.
Yeah, temporary insanity. Or Moshe also has discussed it, but there might be a difference between. It sounds terrible even discussing this, but somebody who shoots himself, God forbid, and jumping off a bridge. Because jumping off a bridge, we can assume that in the time that he was in the air, he did tshuva. He immediately regretted it. He said it's impossible for a person to regret, whereas something which happens instantly, we don't say that. But even in that case, we almost always, chalil v'chas, that shouldn't happen, but it's almost always treated as a regular shiva. I've heard even cases where I've heard even shilas is permitted to name after them, because maybe one could argue a person should name. And I've heard, in certain obviously, every case needs to be asked, but even in certain instances, they could be named after because, again, we say that it's not, it wasn't them who did it, but it was just whatever was pushing them to do it. Yeah. So he says, so what do you see? So even though it's such a great sin, afilu achitir afilu asafik, right? Even when it's only a doubt that he might come to be disgraced, as the pasuk indicates, penyova arelim, right? Shaul wasn't certain. He says it's possible that these people might come and disgrace him. So what do you see? You see that it's permitted to destroy something so that it doesn't come to a greater bizayon, right? Just like Shaul destroyed himself, so it didn't come to greater bizayon, it didn't come to greater disgrace. So too says the Shus Yaakov, it should be permitted to destroy these Kisvei Kodesh, so that it doesn't come to a greater disgrace when the guy come and pick it up and use it for who knows what. Right? Sound good? So that's Shus Yaakov's right, which is a fascinating right. Right, and he even goes on to compare. He says that we know that a Sefer Torah and a person are compared, because the Gemara says that a person who stands, if a person is there at a time when somebody passes away. So when we're all familiar with the fact that a relative has to tear keriah, has to rip, but really the ikar din, somebody who's standing there b'shas yisiyas neshama, who witnesses somebody pass away, they have to tear keriah. Why is that? The Gemara says, "Halamaza doma l'ros sefer Torah nisraf." Witnessing a person pass away is like seeing a sefer Torah which is burnt. And Rashi says because every single person has Torah and mitzvahs. So when a person passes away, it's almost like they're seeing a sefer Torah pass away.
Yeah, but I heard someone, I don't know if it was Rav Moshe or not, true that non-family members would not have to keriah because otherwise they would leave the room if it would mean tearing keriah.
That's right.
Yeah,
so Chaim's point, a very good point. If you learn the Gemara and if you learn the Shulchan Aruch, it's very clear that any person who witnesses somebody pass away, they would have to tear keriah. But later nowadays it's very rare that this happens. That's because, as Chaim mentioned, we're afraid that if people realize they're going to have to tear their begadim, then they're going to leave. And we certainly want that their people should be around them at the time. We want people to say vidoy. It's a big schus for them. So that's why this is not really practiced so often. But again, Meikara did, strictly speaking, that is the practice. And therefore he says, just like if we permit, if Shaul was allowed to kill himself in order to not fall into further disgrace, so too a Sefer Torah would be permitted. Now the Shus Yaakov just continue. He concludes. He says certainly if there's a better option. Right? I'm not promoting this as the ideal. Obviously, I agree that the Gemara says very clearly that the ideal procedure in dealing with worn out sefarim is to bury it. But we're talking about a b'diavad. However, he says, but even within this, it's still better. Don't just burn it outright. What you should do is as follows. He said, burn them slowly but surely at a time, in a small, take a vessel, a container. Yeah, kind of. But he said, he said, put it in a vessel, burn it, kind of like cremation, and then you put the ashes, and then the ashes you put together with Talmud Chacham, right? So this way it's a little more bearable, right? As opposed to having, sometimes you see these huge wagons, of a wagon full of geniza. So burn it all and put the dust together with it, so that becomes much smaller, obviously. So this is the tshuva of the Shus Yaakov, and this is just a second. Yeah. Where is? So the Knesset Yecheskel, who I mentioned was his mechutin, he argued vehemently against this, and he said, no, this is certainly not halacha, and we'll just quickly, So first he quotes, So he quotes the tshuva of Rabbi Yaakov, and he responds as follows. He says that no, it's not necessarily a proof from Shaul. He says because Shaul was different, because that Shaul understood that the other Jews would sacrifice themselves for the king, right? Al-Kiddush Hashem. And basically he knew that if he didn't give himself up, many more people would be killed. So he said, it wasn't just Shaul, that which Shaul was permitted to sacrifice himself wasn't just to prevent further disgrace to himself, but rather Shaul understood as a matter of pekuach nefashos for others, because if he didn't, he realized that many other people will sacrifice themselves, and to avoid that, that's why Shaul did it. So again, so the Shus Yaakov is saying, we have a proof from Shaul HaMelech that it's to avoid further disgrace is permitted, to which Knesset Chazak responds, no, and he's based on a marshal in Bava Kama, that no, Shaul did it to prevent further pekuach nefashos. So that's his first claim back. Then he also gets at an interesting question, which we mentioned before. What about the fact the fact that it wasn't handwritten, does that make any better? So again, so he's saying a Sefer Torah certainly wouldn't be permitted. But what about this, right? This was freshly printed off our printer. So does this have the same level of kedusha as a Sefer Torah? So he quotes a Chavaz Yair, which is a Tshuva Sefer, who says Defus Eino Kadosh, which is printed does not have kedusha because it's made by a machine, similar to the famous machine matzahs controversy, right? Can we use machine matzah because we know it has to be lishma? Does that can we say that a machine has some type of level of lishma or not? However, he says that the Masas B'Yamin, who's another important halachic work, who says it is kadosh, and he says an interesting thing here. He says that the Chavaz Yair, who is the one who says that it's not kadosh, he says that no, because tefus is a new thing, it's a relatively new invention, and he says, what do you mean? He said Moshe Rabbeinu, who spoke mouth to mouth with Hashem, Shlomo, who was the smartest of all men, you don't think they knew how to create tefus? Right? He said, certainly they knew how to. They had no need to it. The Dvar Shal Peh Lo Yishon Lichtav. At that time, right, until Rabbeinu Kaddish came along and wrote the Mishnah, it wasn't permitted to write Torah Sheba'al Peh. See, they certainly had no reason to invent the tefus, right? So that means, again, you could only have basically Sefer Torah, which anyways had to be written on a sofer. So they didn't have any of this, right? There's no such thing as sefarim, right? So he's saying there's no point of tefus. They certainly could have, but just because it's a new invention doesn't mean that it's automatically not kaddish. So then the Shvus Yaakov responds. He says, well, if you're going to tell me that there's a difference between Ibn Nefesh and Kisvei Kodesh, he said, you're right. He said, you're right. That was a case of Sekanas Nefashos. But again, I'm just trying to find some type of source. You're asking me to find some type of yishuv. And sometimes when we're in a tight spot, we try to find some halachic source to back it up. So he's saying that if there's going to be any halachic source to permit burning sefarim, this would be it. Certainly, there is room to wiggle out of it and say that the case of Shaul was different. But that's basically the ultimate. That would be, if there's going to be any source, this would be the source. So there we have it, and this goes on back and forth, a few more times. But essentially, they each stand their ground. The Shvus Yaakov says there is some type of room to permit burning, and the Knesset Cheskel says vehemently that no, there's no source whatsoever. Just before we conclude, two more interesting applications to this question in different forms, and one is that when Israel decided to pull out from Gush Katif, right? What year was that? 2005? 2004? 2005, the summer. It was in the summer, right? Because I remember in the summer it was Yehudi, Lo Megarish Yehudi, or it was orange, right?
Yeah.
So there's Jewish settlements there, and so the people you could pull out, and the sefarim and the Sefer Torah you could pull out, but what do you do about the buildings? Right? We know that there's very strict halachas about basic knesses. You're not allowed to sell the basic knesses. You're not to. So what do you? But the problem was that if you leave it standing, then what's going to happen? Chas v'shalom, who knows what these Arabs are going to do to it? So the question, so they wrote a shaila to, I think, the Rabbanut, asking, is it permitted to to destroy it in a respectful way, so to speak? Better that than to leave it in the hands of the Arabs. The person writing it says, if only they would have asked the Rabbanut whether it's permitted to pull out of Gaza altogether, that would have been a little better. I think time that's been proven prophetic. So that became a question. And another fascinating question is also, this is actually one of the very first tshuvas. If you look in Igros Moshe, or Chelik Aleph, Or Chaim Chelik Aleph, very first Igros Moshe that was printed, in the very first few tshuvas over there's a fascinating tshuva from, that was actually, the shaila was sent by Rav Hutner, the great Rashiv of Chaim Berlin. And the question is, if a person is going to be admitted to a hospital with, and it was a certain type of disease, where certain type of disease, they don't let anything out, right? Anything which comes in can't come out. So everything is burnt. So the question is, he's going to be there for however long, a few weeks, and he needs tefillin. So is a person allowed to send in tefillin knowing that it's going to have to be burnt on the way out, right? So what would you say?
No.
What?
No.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. So the only...
I think I have a safer on what's fun that talks about it.
Yeah.
I don't know if
This became a famous question. So Moshe felt... Right. The only argument, yes, is that in this case, right, why is this a little bit different? Because it's not us burning it, right? There's not us burning it, meaning the hospital says, listen, nothing can come out, and they take it and they dispose of it. So perhaps it's a little better than us, l'chatchila burning it, but Moshe still feels strongly that it should not be done. So again, these are just some of the applications. Where it's most common nowadays is, if you especially go to Eretz Yisrael or you go to Lakewood, every week you walk in and there are literally piles and piles, and Baruch Hashem, there's so many, gilyonos and pamphlets coming out with Torah, so it builds up, right? Every week after week, you have 20 different, literally, you can walk into a shul and they have one table in the front, have 20 different Torah publications, and some of them are thick and beautiful stuff in there. So what do you do with all that? So ideally, it should be disposed of in the proper way in Geniza. But unfortunately, this doesn't always happen. So actually, I think the modern day application, which I've seen some discuss, is it permitted to recycle it, right? Because recycling, maybe you could say somewhat similar to burning it. So you have to discuss the merits whether if there's any heter to burn it, would recycling fall under the same category? But again, obviously, we try to do it in the most because Kisvei Kodesh are important things, and we want to dispose of it in the most respectable way. So Geniza is always the number one way of doing it. Now it's interesting. If anyone's ever buried a kfur, sometimes at a burial, they'll kind of as they're filling it up, they'll throw in a few boxes. This is
I've seen it.
So
I think the kfur said it was made for recently.
Yeah.
I thought I saw something.
Yeah. So sometimes they'll do that.
And at my grandma's funeral, I think it was my father's mother, almost 8 years ago. Erev Hanukkah, first day, because she passed on Erev Hanukkah next day. The officiating rabbi, I think, was a chaplain, brought a few, not many.
Right. So sometimes they'll do that as well.
Either near on top of a casket or something, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
I think the final decision in groups of people is they left the synagogues.
Oh, they did leave the synagogues.
Because I remember seeing the Arabs dancing on top of them.
Yeah.
And nice stuff.
Wow.